So the scripture passage this morning comes to us from the Gospel according to Matthew, the 27th chapter. This is a story that you're very familiar with. Let me just kind of do a quick setup for you. The setting is this is the story of Judas. Judas has just got done betraying Jesus. You remember they're at the Last Supper. Jesus says, "One of you will betray me." They all ask, "Who is it? I? Is it I? Is it I?" Turns out being Judas. Judas goes to the Pharisees and sells Jesus off for the 30 pieces of silver. They go to the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus is arrested, and Judas realizes that he's done a terrible thing, and he comes back to the high priests. And the story picks up right here. Listen for God's word as it comes to us today. In the first light of dawn, all the high priests and religious leaders met and put the finishing touches on their plot to kill Jesus. Then they tied him up and paraded him to Pilate, the governor. Judas, the one who betrayed him, realized that Jesus was doomed. Overcome with remorse, he gave back the 30 silver coins to the high priest, saying, "I've sinned. I betrayed an innocent man." They said, "What do we care? That's your problem." And Judas threw the silver coins into the temple and left. Then he went out and hung himself. And here the story ends. May God bless these words as we seek to apply them to our lives. Judas, come home, all is forgiven. This is a sermon. I have two different angles that I'm going to be working at today. The first angle I want you to think about, this sermon is written for those of you, if you have somebody who has done you wrong, if you have someone who has somehow hooked you, and you need to somehow put your microphone back on your ear so that it stays. If you need to somehow reframe your relationship with them, somehow come to a new place where you can accept who they are and realize that they're just human beings, and human beings make a mistake, then I want you to listen to this sermon. The other angle that I'm working on is that if you are someone who has made a mistake, if you're one of these people who have done something wrong, that as Judas said, that you have sinned, and somehow your action has just altered your life, that your mistake has sent your life going in a completely different direction, and you have been reeling for years. And if you could just go back to one certain spot of time and change what it is that you have done, then this sermon is for you. Because this is about Easter. We're now in the season of Eastertide. And if Easter is to make any difference in our lives, it's going to be more than just a holiday that we celebrated a few years ago, but it's about something, who we are and how we live and how we interact with God and how we interact with other people. The theme for this coming, I have my thing upside down, but there we go. For this whole time is there life after Easter? How does Easter affect who we are? I want to thank Justin for creating this slide. I just love how he's so creative as he'll put these things together. And what I'm going to be doing for the next several weeks is looking at the different minor characters in the Easter story, people that we rarely think about. Today I'm going to be preaching about Judas. Next week I'm going to be preaching about the Roman soldiers who crucified Jesus. The Sunday after that I'm going to be preaching about Barabbas. The Sunday after that I'm going to be talking about Mary and the women who followed Jesus. The Sunday after that is the highest holy day of the church year, Cowboy Sunday. We'll have our own celebration. But today, what I want to do is I want to look at Judas. Judas. You know, we all have our opinions about Judas, and those opinions are kind of set. And Judas, you know, is always portrayed as this kind of snake oil kind of guy. You know, all through Matthew's gospel, he's the one who's kind of lurking there in the background. He's the one who's kind of foreshadowed is going to be the one who's to set Jesus up and betray him and actually put the whole wheels in motion that leads to his crucifixion. You know, I've always had a heart for Judas. You know, I've always kind of felt like, you know, well, if I was one of the disciples, I would really hope that I'd be someone like Peter. You know, Peter just never really kind of gets it, but at least his heart is in the right place. You know, but instead, I really know that I would probably end up being Judas. Because, you know, I'm somebody who, you know, my heart is sometimes in the right place, but I make huge mistakes. They kind of alter my life and other people's lives. And that's why when I think about Judas, I don't like thinking about him as this snake oil salesman, but I like to think about that Judas was just a guy. Judas was somehow a part of it, and in the midst. And somehow he got wrapped up in the whole turmoil of everything that was going on, and he made a horrendous mistake. And unfortunately, down through the centuries, we've remembered Judas as the guy who hung himself. In fact, what's really interesting is that, that if you ask anybody, and even people who are not Christians, you ask them, who is Judas? What did Judas do? And they'll be able to tell you, well, he's the guy who betrayed Jesus. And then if you ask them, well, how did Judas die? And almost everybody knows Judas hung himself. And that was actually my mental mindset for years and years about who Judas was. Until recently. Recently, as in maybe 5 to 7 years ago. I started thinking about Judas. And it dawned on me that the image that we have about Judas hanging himself comes from Matthew's gospel. Well, I've always known this, but I thought about Luke's gospel. There's Luke Acts, which is actually, while it's separated by John, Luke and Acts are one gospel. And in Acts gospel, the first chapter, we find out that Judas is alive. And he took the 30 pieces of silver that were given to him, and he bought a piece of land. And that while he lived on the land, for a certain length of time, at some point, he stretched out. He fell over. The text says he fell over and his bowels gushed out. How's that for an image? His bowels gushed out. He died. His bowels gushed out. So in one gospel we have that he hung himself, another that he fell over and his bowels gushed out. What do we make of that? In both these two gospels, he's dead. Well, then I started thinking, I don't know why it took me, 25 years of ministry and studying the Bible to think about this. I started thinking, well, what does Mark's gospel say? Well, in Mark's gospel, I read through Mark's gospel, and at the end of the gospel, Judas is alive. He's not killed. I went, what? And I reread through it. Judas is alive. In fact, the last verse of Mark's gospel is the women go to the tomb, find that Jesus is alive, and they run screaming, terrified. What? That's it. It ends. The women are terrified. There's no, Christ the Lord has risen today. It's just, he's dead. I mean, Jesus is alive. They're terrified. Judas is alive. I went, wow. Well, then I said, well, what does John's gospel have to say about Judas? So I went over and I picked up John, and I started leafing through it, kind of read through the whole gospel, got to the end, and I said, Judas is alive at the end of John's gospel. There's no mention at all about Judas's death. And I went, wow, what does that mean? Now, there's some people say, well, no, look at Matthew's gospel said that he hung himself, so he's dead. So that's really kind of the official story, so we go with that official story. No, you can't. Because when I teach New Testament, one of the things I tell people, I really believe the two most important words, and I hammer this on people, in the New Testament are the words according to. The gospel according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, according to John. In other words, according to means it's their view of an event that happened, it's their view. And one of the things that we like to do, or that we're tempted to do when we study the New Testament, is to pretend that they all say the same story. Well, they don't. Just some basic New Testament introduction. Mark wrote his gospel. He's the first gospel that we know that was written in about AD 75. So something like 45 years after the life of Jesus. Then comes Matthew's gospel. Matthew's gospel was written about 10 to 15 years after Mark's gospel. And Matthew has Mark's gospel in front of him. We know this because he took literally almost every single verse from Mark and put it in his gospel, and he writes some things around it. Matthew knows nothing about Luke. Doesn't even know that there is a Luke or there is a Luke's gospel. Luke doesn't know much about Mark, but he knows something that's called the Q source, which are all the stories about Jesus. So Luke has his own material and writes his stuff and has his own perspective. And John was written, actually, one of the later gospels, somewhere in the late 80s, somewhere into the mid-90s, completely separate. We think actually that John lived out in the desert. Knew nothing of these other gospel writers, had his own perspective. So, when it comes to saying they all say the same story, no, that's not the case. They tell a very, very different story. And one of the key things that we need to do as students of the Bible is to allow them to have their own story and ask ourselves, what does it mean? What does it mean? And for me, the significance is, okay, Matthew says that he's dead. Luke says he died later. Mark and John tell a different story. Well, I decided that I have to let Mark go because what I've decided is that in Mark's gospel, the ending is all about Jesus and his suffering. And Mark's gospel is about how do we make sense out of our suffering. John's gospel, though, is completely else. There's something going on with Mark's gospel that I believe is about Judas. All of the gospel is about Judas. Now, I'm going to teach you some things today in the next few minutes that'll be brand new material. Brand new material. If you fall asleep in the next 10 minutes, everybody else will have their life changed and you'll be going, oh, what happened? If you make your grocery list, the same thing. You need to be hanging with me because I'm going to tell you something that I discovered, and literally I discovered, when I was reading through John's gospel. And when I read it, I had to put the Bible down. I had to rub my eyes, pick it up and read it again. I called one of my best buddies, a minister out in Long Island. We've known each other our entire careers. I said, Mark, get your Bible. Let's do this over the phone. Let me show you what you saw, what I found. He goes, wow, you found this? And I said, yeah. He said, this is nuts. You're nuts. Can you corroborate this with anybody? Nope. So just little old you. Yep. He goes, wow, good luck with that. And I haven't been able to corroborate it with anybody. There's not another scholar out there that is going to tell you what I'm about to tell you. So what I've decided is that I could be very, very wrong. Well, that happens almost every single Sunday. However, we could be in on a groundbreaking something. And if nothing else for me, this is a powerful metaphor about who Judas is and maybe about who we are. So here's what happened. I was reading through John's gospel, and the setup is the table of the Last Supper when Jesus says that one of you are going to betray me. And what I've done is I've lifted the gospel, the passage out to put it here in front of you, and I'm going to walk us through this. Okay. After saying this, they have had communion. After saying this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and declared, very truly I tell you, one of you will betray me. The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he was speaking. One of his disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter, therefore, mentioned to him to ask Jesus whom he was speaking. In other words, who's going to betray him. So while reclining next to Jesus, he asked him, Lord, who is it? Jesus answered, it is the one to whom I give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish. So when he had dipped the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. After he received the piece of bread, Satan entered into him. Jesus said to him, do quickly what you are going to do. Now, no one at the table knew why he said this to him. Some thought that because Judas had the common purse, Jesus was telling him, buy what we need for the festival, or that he should give something to the poor. So after receiving the piece of bread, he immediately went out, and it was night. So our picture, our image of this passage has been given to us by artists down through the ages. And I picked this particular painting from Bassano in the 1500s because it really accurately portrays what is going on in this passage, or kind of accurately. You know, if you have read the Da Vinci Code, or if you've seen the movie Da Vinci Code, then it focuses on the painting of the Last Supper. But I looked at that copy, and it was a little too blurry, so I went with this one from Masonic, because it kind of captures the image of what is going on. First of all, there is Jesus. Here are the other disciples. Notice that many of the other disciples are older. We actually think that the disciples were very young. We think that the disciples were maybe anywhere from 18, 19, 21, 22, up to about 25. So very, very young. The key thing here is the disciple whom Jesus loved. And my little red thing just went out. The disciple whom Jesus loved. There's tremendous speculation about who is this disciple whom Jesus loved. Because all throughout John's gospel, the author refers to the disciple whom Jesus loved. Well, there's great speculation about who Jesus loved. Again, if you look at Da Vinci's painting, Da Vinci has it painted so that it looks like it's Mary Magdalene. In fact, it was really kind of fun. There's a lot of crazy research that's always being done, and I know that I'm kind of adding to this crazy research, that this one guy took the Da Vinci painting, took a mirror image of it, resupposed the mirror image upon it, and it looks as though it is Mary and she's holding a baby. But of course, did Da Vinci have a mirror that he reimposed? Anyways, fun stuff. You know, some people wonder if the disciple whom Jesus loved was a lover, that he had a partner. Was Jesus gay? Because when you read through in the Greek, it is not very clear what is the relationship that Jesus is having with this beloved disciple. The key thing to pay attention to is that it is Jesus' best friend. However you want to define that. Wife, partner, just someone that he loves and cares about. It's Jesus' best friend. And the setting is that they are at the table and they're reclining together, and Jesus says, one of you are going to betray me. Now, let me read for you the passage again. Now that you have this visual in your mind, let me read you the passage again. After saying this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and declared, very truly I tell you, one of you will betray me. The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he was speaking. One of his disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter therefore motioned to him to ask Jesus whom he was speaking. In other words, hey, ask the master who is going to betray him. So while reclining next to Jesus, he asked him, Lord, who is it that's going to betray you? Jesus answered, it is the one to whom I give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish. So when he had dipped the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, Simon, son of Simon Iscariot. After he received the piece of bread, saying, okay, perfect. Now, here's where the light bulb went, bam, in my brain. We have this mental image of what is happening at the table. Jesus is here. The beloved disciple is reclining against him. The beloved disciple asks, Master, who it is that is going to betray you? He says, it is the one to whom I dip the piece of bread and give it to him. So our image is this. He takes a piece of bread, dips it, and gives it to Judas, so that he stretches his arm out and he gives it to him. That's the image that we have. What hit me is, what if Jesus does this? Then suddenly, the beloved disciple who is going to betray, or the one who's going to betray Jesus, is the beloved disciple. And suddenly the author is telling us, in a sleight of hand, the beloved disciple, the unnamed beloved disciple, is Judas. Is Judas. It is his closest friend who is going to betray him. Judas then gets up and leaves the table and puts all these wheels in motion. When I did that, instead of doing this, I did this, because it doesn't say how he did it. We create it in our brain, but that doesn't say that he did this. In fact, I'm going to tell you some things that will blow you away, because it blew me away. The first thing that hit me is if Judas is the beloved disciple, then he is like me. And he is like you. Because we have all made horrendous mistakes. We have all, in some way, shape, or form, have betrayed Jesus, turned on Jesus, not lived up to his teachings. And suddenly I can identify with this beloved disciple, Judas, who betrayed the Lord. I can see myself written into this story. And somehow, if Judas is alive at the end of the gospel, then maybe somehow I can still be alive after my huge mistakes. What really then took me aback, when I began reading the rest of John's gospel, from the perspective of Judas being the beloved disciple, is what happens next. Now, let me tell you the rest of the story. So let's say that Judas is the beloved disciple. He gets up, he goes and he betrays Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. They go to the Garden of Gethsemane. Judas comes and kisses Jesus, which, if you're the beloved disciple, we always think the kiss is like, oh, what a snaky thing to do. No, it's the most perfect thing to do. They're best buddies. They're close. Betrays him with a kiss. Arrested, tried, convicted, crucified, resurrected. Y'all know the story, right? I actually picked for Easter to read the Easter story from John's Gospel so I could set this story up. Because after the resurrection in John's Gospel, Jesus then appears to the disciples. He appears to the disciples on that Easter Sunday as they're walking on the road to Emmaus. He appears to them, and then he breaks bread with them. And then later the disciples are meeting behind a closed door, and Jesus appears to them and says, "Peace be among you." And he says, "Touch my hands, put your hand on my side, believe that it's me." Then the very last scene in John's Gospel is the scene that I have put up here, this painting. I don't know the painter or the year, but it kind of shows what's happening. Is that the disciples, after Jesus kind of disappears, they kind of go back to what they know, what they've always known to do, and that's fish. So they're out there fishing. And this is when they're fishing and they're catching no fish. Jesus appears, and he's on the beach. And he says, "Hey, cast your nets on the other side." So they cast their nets on the other side. They bring in this huge haul of fish, and they think it's a miracle. And Peter looks to the beach and realizes it's Jesus. He strips off his clothes. He dives into the water, and he swims. There's an embrace. Jesus has already made a fire. They have breakfast. And while they're eating, in this last story from Matthew's Gospel, from John's Gospel, John, Jesus says, "Simon Peter, do you love me?" And Peter says, "Of course I love you. Of course I love you." Jesus says, "Feed my sheep." And Jesus asked Peter this 3 times. "Peter, do you love me? Do you love me?" And the symbolism of it is that since Peter denied Jesus 3 times, that by Jesus asking Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" it's restoring that relationship. That's the significance of it. Then something happens. This is where you got to really wake up and watch, because this is where I had to put the Bible down. Something happens. There is a disciple not with the other disciples. Let me read you what happens next. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. He was the one who had reclined next to Jesus at the supper and had said, "Lord, who is it that is going to betray you?" when Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, Lord, what about him? Jesus said to him, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me. So the rumor spread in the community that this disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he would not die, but if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Now, I don't know if you're seeing what I saw. What blew me away, if indeed Judas is the beloved disciple, then this passage makes so much sense. If it doesn't, if Judas is not the beloved disciple, this makes no sense because it's kind of out of the blue. The disciples are eating, they have a breakfast, Peter and Jesus are restored. Peter looks and sees the disciple that is separated and says, hey man, what are we supposed to do with him? It's kind of what it is. What are we supposed to do with him? And he says, leave him alone. Well, there's no context. Make him Judas, the beloved disciple. Notice the reference in the verse to the communion. Why would the author put that in there? Suddenly, if there's a disciple that's not with the other 12, especially if he's the disciple that set this whole mess up and has been rejected by the other group, then suddenly this passage means tons. Lord, what are we to do with him? Jesus says, leave him alone. Hands off of him. Don't worry about him. You don't get it. You don't know the full story, so don't worry about the full story. If I say that he's supposed to live, then let him live. You follow me. In other words, it's none of your business. Remember, the gospel ends with Judas being alive. Well, I set the Bible down and rubbed my eyes and just was blown away. Because you know what this means? That Judas was just a guy. Jesus' best friend who made a horrific mistake. And it got me thinking about all my mistakes. And it got me thinking about all your mistakes. And all kinds of mistakes. Yeah, and this is a huge one where he's ostracized from the rest of the group. And if you've ever been ostracized from anybody, you know that pain, baby. The disciples go off their merry way, and let's say I am right. What does Judas then do? What does Judas do? He has to go on his own, does he not? He has to go on his own. And he then has to spend the rest of his life making sense out of his mistake. Have you not ever had to spend the rest of your life making sense out of your mistake? I mean, haven't you ever had to get to some point in your life where you had to forgive yourself for the mistake that you made and accept God's grace and God's forgiveness on your behalf? And isn't faith at its deepest part is realizing that God looks at you and forgives you? And that somehow when you feel that grace, the most powerful thing is then to extend that grace to other people and help them make sense out of their own mistakes and past so that they too can understand God's grace and forgiveness? I believe that's what Judas did. Because let me show you how the Gospel of John ends. Let me back up one. Lord, who is it that is going to betray you? First of all, when Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus left following them, he was the one who would recline next to Jesus at the supper and said, Lord, who is it that is going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, Lord, what do we do with him? Jesus said, it is my will that he remain, blah, 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 blah. Okay, I have this slide, and then here's the verse that follows. This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them, and we know that his testimony is true. The beloved disciple wrote the Gospel of John. Well, what if I'm right? Then you know what? Judas is the author of the Gospel of John. Judas, out of his searching, came to a place where he was able to accept God's grace and understood it in such a profound way that later on in his life he was motivated to tell the story of Jesus according to him. When this hit me, I began to think about myself and my own sins and your sins. This past weekend I was going through a journal. I've been keeping a journal since I was 18 years old. Racks of journals. I was reading through the journal from this past year and I had a dream. I had a dream where a Catholic church, a neighboring Catholic church, their priest wasn't there, so they asked me to hear confession. I said, I'm not a priest. I've never done this before. They said, no, we want you to hear confession. So in the dream, I got in the little booth, and one by one, the children, they wanted me to hear the confession of their children. And the children came in, and they were confessing everything that they had done. And I was in the dream, I was so moved because I kept on thinking, God, these kids feel as though they have done these horrible things. And it's not that big a deal. I got out of the booth. And I started holding each one of these kids in the dream. And I said, you are forgiven. You are forgiven. What you have done is not that big of a deal. You're kids. I woke up from the dream. I went, man, I suddenly got our sins from God's perspective. Here are his children kind of groveling. And God is saying, you're forgiven. You're forgiven. The Gospel of John is written by somebody who realized he was forgiven. Is there life after Easter? We should ask the beloved disciple.